Couple of weeks on Wednesday nights, the last couple of Wednesday nights, we've had a lesson in regard to the consecration of the body. And we simply recognized in that lesson, the beginning of it, and each of the two lessons that we had, that, we cannot obey a command. God has not given us a command that which man can obey without using some members of his body. And of course, when we commit sin, well, that is true as well. And so this is just simply a continuation then of those two lessons in which we have mentioned the consecration of the eye and of the ear. Now then we want to notice a little bit about the tongue. And so we need to keep in mind that Paul had written to the Roman letter in the 6th chapter of the book of Romans in verse 13, "Neither yield ye yourselves, your members, as instruments of righteousness, neither yield ye yourselves as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but alive unto God." And so here we can see then that we're not to yield the members of our body to sin, but yield it to righteousness. And so we use a member of our body in regards to the commandments of God. In the 1st chapter, or the 12th chapter of the book of Romans, and in verse 1, Paul said again, "I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service." Well, I'd like for us then to turn to the 3rd chapter of the book of James, and we would like to read, perhaps we'll just read verses 1 through 12 of James chapter 3. And this, of course, is the proper use of our tongues, a member of our body. And we can see now that this is a very unruly member as we get into this. In James chapter 3, he said, "My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Behold, we put bits in the horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn about their whole body. Behold also the ships, which though they be so great, and are driven of fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the helm or the governor lisses. Even so the tongue is a little member, and boastful, and boasteth great things. Behold how great a matter a little fire kindleth. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell. For every kind of beast, and of birds, and of serpents, and of things in the sea is tamed, and hath been tamed of mankind. But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. Doth a fountain send forth at the same place sweet water and bitter? Can the fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries, either a vine figs? So can no fountain both yield salt water and fresh. Now then, as we note this chapter, the 12 verses of James chapter 3, and we want to emphasize a few of these things as we go along. We can see here in verse 1 of this 3rd chapter that we have an admonition, and then we have a reason for that admonition. The admonition is as you notice here, my brethren, be not many masters. And then he gives the reason, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. We need to realize that here is something that we need to learn as we talk about this member of our body, a small member, the tongue. And we can see in this the ability here to control the tongue is evidence of strong character. If we have that ability to control the tongue, well, then it indicates that we are a mature person, a full-grown, a man that is of age in the faith and in his life. In these 2nd through the 5th verses of this reading, for in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. Now that word perfect there is a word from which we can get the word full grown, of age, mature. And so he's talking about a mature man. And the man who's able to control his tongue is a man who is characterized as being a mature person. And in this case, of course, James writing, we find that he writes to Christians, and Christian people are to be mature enough that they can keep their tongue under control. But it's an uncontrollable thing at times if we do not keep the bridle on it, keep it in check, in place. Well, we notice too that the tongue, he points out to us here, is the most unruly member. Hence, if we can control the tongue, well, then we can control the entire person. We can control the entire body. And this is truth. This truth is illustrated here, as you will notice, by number one, the bridle. You know, people who are familiar with horses and the bridle and all that goes along with dealing with horses realize the truth of that. If the rider retains control of the bridle, well, then he contains control of the horse. That is, regardless of the size of his body, the little bridle that is able to fit over his head and put the bits in his mouth, we can see can be controlled by that person who has charge of the bridle. Well, also he illustrates this then with the rudder. You know, a ship may be very large, and yet the rudder being a very small thing in regards to that, and to lose control of that rudder would certainly cause you to lose control of the ship. And so to have control of it, then you would be in charge of the ship. You would have control of that. Now then, in that first chapter of the book of James, we go back to verse 26. And here James says, if any man among you seem to be religious, and bridleth not his tongue, but deceiveth his own heart, this man's religion is vain. So, yes, oftentimes we find vain religion among people, and many of them professing to be true Christians, but yet they may not illustrate that with the use of their tongue, or oftentimes with other members of the body. So here we can see then that pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this. And he also lists some other things, but we're interested now, of course, in the tongue. The tongue has possibilities for great evil. Now, it doesn't mean that it will be used for that. A person may be in control of it, but it has that possibility, as we can see, for great evil, beginning with verse 5 and reading through about verse 8. Even so the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. so is the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire of hell. For every kind of beast, and of birds, and of serpents, and of things in the sea is tamed, and hath been tamed of mankind. But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Well, we can think about various animals that are trained, and you can pretty well depend on them in most part to do as you have trained them to do. But this tongue, we can't take our eyes off from it. We can't leave it alone. We have to keep the bridle on it constantly. It can be trained, or rather it can do as you direct it to do in regards to the bridle that you put on it. So we always have to have that bridle to keep it. Sometimes a person wants to say something, but he tastes his words and he see that I can't do that because that would not be very Christian. I'd like to maybe express my opinion about it, and if it's not going to, show that I'm out of control, well then that would be all right. But at the same time, we need to realize that I better watch what I say, because I can be taken in the wrong way, and it certainly then would do no good in that respect. So though it's one of the smallest members of the body, it is capable of doing more harm than any other. Its capacity for evil is illustrated by James. And let us notice now, as we start out, he says that it is illustrated here by it being a fire. In the 11th chapter of the book of Proverbs, in verse 13, a talebearer revealeth secrets, but he that is of a faithful spirit concealeth the matter. You see, there's a faithful spirit that has control of it, and he conceals what he might hear that would be detrimental to others. And he is an individual then that's not going to be revealing secrets. Some things best to be kept a secret in reference to other people especially. And so we can see here that the tongue then, as he illustrates it here, as being a fire. And then as we look at the 26th chapter of the book of Proverbs, and in the 20th verse, we find that the wise man Solomon said, where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. So where there is no talebearer, the strife ceases. And so you burn wood, and you can kind of separate that wood from its burning, and eventually, when off by itself, it's going to burn out. Or if you take away the wood, the fire goes out. And so if you want to add a little more fuel to it, just keep putting the wood to it and burning it that way. And so here the man Solomon is simply saying that where no wood is, the fire goeth out. And where there is no talebearer, the strife ceases. In other words, that's don't just keep agging it on, because it amounts to no good end. It can also cause fists to fly, and it can, cause hard feelings, and people will not have any respect for one another because they're not able to keep, their tongue still in reference to any secret that they might have. And then we notice too that it defileth the whole body, what James is saying here. Iniquity in heart defiles the soul, but yet on the other hand we can see when spoken it defiles the body. And in Mark the 7th chapter and in the 20th verse of that chapter, we find that the Lord makes the statement in regards to, for from within, these things appear. And then in the 4th chapter of the book of Ephesians, and in verse 29, we notice that Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus. And here he simply said to them, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers." So there are some things that we have to, have a negative to, and we don't want to let corrupt communication proceed out of our mouth. Well, in the 6th chapter of the book of Proverbs, and in verse 19, we notice that the writer simply points out that a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. In that preceding verses, he said, 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are abomination unto him: a proud look, and lying tongue, and hands that show sheds innocent blood. He names all of those things. But in this particular lesson, we're interested in that lying tongue. And then let's notice again that here the writer James points out to us that after the defiling the body, then we can see the tongue works destruction through all society. That's the uncontrolled tongue, the use of the tongue. And so in that 6th chapter, once again, of the book of Proverbs, and in verse 19, I think it's a good passage that we could all profit by learning. We've already used it this morning. A false witness that speaketh lies, and a whisper and that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among brethren. And then another statement made by Solomon in the 16th chapter and in verse 28. He said, "A forward man soweth strife, and a whisper separateth chief friends." And how often has that been the case down through the history of mankind, that they separate, or the tongue separates chief friends? Several years ago, and I've read it on different occasions, Brother B.T. Larimore, who was during the period of the Civil War, and a great preacher, and he has 4 or 5, I know 4 of 4, but I've got 3 copies of it, of his book, B.T. Larimore and His Boys. And he is given a lot of information in regards to sermons and various things. But he told of a situation back in, I believe, the state of Kentucky, that there were 2 boys who grew up. They were friends, and their families were friends, been friends for years. And these 2 boys, when they graduated out of high school, they went off to school of higher learning, one to study for being a doctor and the other to be a lawyer. And when these boys came back home, they went away as friends, and when they came back home for the summer, then people got to talking. And some people were saying, well, boy A is a lot smarter than boy B. And others said, no, boy B is smarter than boy A. And so in this got into the families. And so the boys who came home from school as being friends went back as enemies. And then when they graduated, they came, and the doctor practiced medicine and the lawyer was practicing law. And this feud and this bitterness toward one another grew. And in an election year, boy A took the opposite side of boy B, and they argued over the political things. And so one day they got into a heated argument. Boy A pulled his gun and shot boy B. And boy B then, in process, I suppose, of dying or falling, he pulled his gun and shot the other boy. And so they had separated chief friends with all of their talk. One killed the other. And this went on for some time, and finally the mother of one of these boys felt like that, they were getting older and they need to try to mend things, and she couldn't take it any longer. And so she picked a bow of flowers, and her husband asked her, said, "What are you doing with those? Where are you going with them?" And she said, "Well, I've picked a bouquet of flowers for my boy and one for the boy that my boy shot." And said, "I'm going to take and go over to this boy's mother's and tell her that, I've gathered these." And so when she got there to the house, the mother of this other boy, came to the door and saw who it was, and she said, "What do you want?" And she told her mission. And so she said, "Well, I've been wanting to do that." And together they hugged one another, and they restored that friendship that they had, but it was all too late for the family because they had such a disaster in the family. So it can separate chief friends. That's the reason it's an unruly thing. It's a poisonous thing because it's like fire. I've never been seriously burned, and I hope I never am, but you can just imagine these people who get a serious burn, how much pain they are in. Well, then the tongue can cause a lot of pain. It can cut. Well, we can see here then that this is a problem that we have with an uncontrolled tongue. Well, I want to kind of get on to other part of this lesson, but here we can see that it is an instrument. It's a member of our body that is full of deadly poison, that he says. See where I got to my notes here. In the fourth chapter of the book of Ephesians, in verse 31, is a statement that I think would go along with this. "Let all bitterness," the Apostle Paul wrote, "and wrath and anger and clamor and all evil speaking be put away from you with all malice." So let's put it away. That's part of controlling is, as you noticed in the first lesson we had a couple of weeks ago, those of you who were there, we had mortification and sanctification. That's a converted life. And so the putting to death and putting on righteousness. We put off sin and put on righteousness. Also, we note in this particular statement then, a statement made by Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 in verses 6 and 11, or through 11. And here he says, "Now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly, and not after the tradition which he received of us. For yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we behaved not ourselves disorderly among you, neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Not because we have not power, but to make ourselves an example unto you to follow us. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies." I think it's interesting to note, somehow I feel that the passage that deals with busybody and work goes together. And you can see maybe that being the case when a person has too much time on his hand and he doesn't take care of his own business, he then gets into trying to manage everybody else's business. Well, Paul is saying that we need to keep ourselves occupied with what we need to do and not to become busybodies in that. And of course the tongue is used in the respect of being a busybody. It's not just as hard, somebody might say, well, it's not any difference thinking something and saying it, but yet I think perhaps it is, because if you just keep it within your heart or keep it to yourself, well then it's not going to affect anybody else in a serious way. But we can see the unruly member is a problem to many of us. Well, let's notice now in another section of these notes that he illustrates it by a wild beast. And we think of, various animals, wild animals. We can see the ferocity of the tiger, the mockery of an ape, the poison of a serpent. And we can see he speaks of it as restless evil, full of deadly poison. And yet, let's notice what the tongue is capable of doing. It meddles. 1 Thessalonians 4:11. When Paul said, study to be quiet and be able to not injure with our tongue, and so on. In 1 Peter 4:15, the Apostle Peter wrote, and he said, but if any man suffer, let none of you suffer as a murderer or a stealer or killer or a stealer, and one who sins with the tongue. He said, don't suffer like that. Now, of course, he points out in that next verse, if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. And so we can suffer as a Christian, and we will if we're truly Christians, but let's not be guilty, at least. We may suffer, somebody may falsely accuse us, but let us not prove that to be the case with the kind of life that we live. And then we can see that it repeats the fact that we might tell something and then we keep it going. We repeat that. Over in the book of Psalms, in the 15th chapter and in verse 3, the psalmist says, he that backbiteth not with his tongue, nor doth evil to his neighbor, nor taketh up a reproach against his neighbor. So let's don't be necessarily repeating what we might hear other people say, because who knows, we may not have all the truth. We may not know just exactly what it is, so we don't want to repeat those things without some sufficient and good reason for doing so. If we know something, of course, that the law needs to know about, and we know it to be the fact, well then we certainly should repeat it to the officials. But let's not just take up a tale that we hear and repeat it without our knowing the fact about it. Also, we can see that the tongue then is not only repeats, but it lies. In Proverbs 6, we used a moment ago, where 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are abomination unto him: proud look, a lying tongue. So there's a tongue that is used because it's unbridled oftentimes. How many times have we heard people who profess to be Christian people, who profess to be religious, and almost after they have said those things in regards to matters of religion and how good they are and how much of a Christian they are, then they use a lot of bad language, or they might say something that's not true because it benefits them in some way or the other. And so that's the tongue that we have to keep control over. We can see that it flatters. In Psalms, the 5th chapter, and in verse 9, here the Bible tells us, being a Psalm of David, Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? No, let me get to the 5th chapter, verse 9. There is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is very wickedness. Their throat is an open sepulchre. They flatter with their tongue. Flatter with their tongue. Have you ever known of people that tries to flatter you sometimes, and they've got a purpose in mind? They want to catch you off guard and they get something from you that they know maybe you would not freely give or something. Or we can see that a lot of people do it for various reasons, but people can use flattery, and it's not to the good of the individual that they're flattering. So we need to not use our tongue for that way. It slanders. In the 15th chapter of the book of Psalms, and we notice here that in verse 1, we find that David, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? That's the question that was being asked. Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? He that walketh uprightly and worketh righteousness and speaketh the truth in his heart. He that backbiteth not with his tongue, nor doth evil to his neighbor, nor taketh up a reproach against his neighbor. Who privily slandereth his neighbor, him will I cut off. Him that hath a high look and a proud heart will not I suffer. He won't allow that. And so that's the use of the tongue. And the tongue, of course, picks flaws. In Matthew the 7th chapter, in that great Sermon on the Mount, you remember Jesus made the statement, "Judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again." And then he speaks about the individual trying to pick out the speck out of his brother's eye when all the time there's a beam across his own eye. Now that's pretty humorous, is it not? You can see the man here, that fault finder, he's down here over his neighbor's eye with a magnifying glass, and he's looking through it trying to find that little old speck in there. And all the time he's got a tree log across his nose, and he can't see his own faults. And so there, of course, would be a result of picking flaws and using his tongue in spreading that. It also blasphemes in Matthew 5:34 through 36. Now the tongue has great possibilities for good. In verse 9 of James chapter 3, we find with it, bless he God. And we can see that also we can use it for bad because we curse men. But here for the good is blessing God with it. We sing, as Hebrews 13 and 15, use the fruit of our lips to sing praise unto his name. And so that's a good use of it. It is impossible for it to be used for good and bad at the same time. And he also illustrates that in verses 9 through 12. And so let's look at verses 9 through 12 briefly. We can see that this truth being illustrated by, first of all, a fountain of sending forth sweet water and bitter water at the same time, and by a fig tree that would bring forth different kinds of fruit, good fruit and bad fruit. So let's read that in passing here. He said, verse 9, "Therefore bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. Doth a fountain send forth at the same time, or same place rather, sweet water and bitter? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries, either a vine figs? So can no fountain both yield salt water and fresh." And so we know that being the case. And we can take what Jesus said over in the book of Matthew the 7th chapter, and in verse 16, when he said that you shall know them by their fruit. You shall know them by their fruits. And so you're not going to be using it to bring bad fruit and at the same time for good fruit. And we can see that this would suggest to us that really there is not room for both of them at the same time. Keep thy tongue from evil. Psalm 34 and in verse 13. He that would see good days, the Apostle Peter said, and love life, will refrain his lips from speaking guile and from saying those things that are not in harmony with the will of God. And so we ought to keep in mind a good prayer that the psalmist gave in the book of Psalms 19 and verse 14, when he said, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. And whoso keepeth his mouth and his tongue from evil keepeth his soul from trouble, Proverbs 21 and in verse 23. So a lesson that I think is always good for us to remind ourselves of the kind of people we are. We're children of God, and we need to have the control of that most unruly member of the body, the tongue. Here is a little saying. I don't know the author of this. The unruly member. The boneless tongue, so small and great, can crush and kill, declared the Greek. The tongue destroys a greater horde, the Turk asserts, than does the sword. The Persian proverb wisely saith, a lengthy tongue and early death. Or sometimes takes this form instead, don't let your tongue cut off your head. The tongue can speak a word whose speed, says the Chinese, outsteps the steed. While the Arab saying doth this in part, the tongue's storehouse is the heart. From Hebrew writ the maxim sprung, though feet may slip, near let the tongue. And then I've written here a couple lines that have kind of crumbled together there that I wrote on down below here where I can read it a little better. The sacred writ that crowns the whole, who keeps his tongue, have kept the soul. And so let's keep our tongue in check as we live our Christian life for the Lord Jesus Christ. The lesson is yours, and should there be any of us that need to respond to the Lord's invitation, this be the opportunity while together we stand and sing.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity you afforded us to come here to gather, sing praises to you and worship you. Father, we pray that you give us a safe trip home. Father, you be with those that have been mentioned this morning, especially Loretta as she is nearing the end of her life. Father, be with those, her family members and friends around her, and doctors who care for her and comfort her. Father, you give them comfort. Father, we ask you to be with Russ as he continues to work over the Marshall Islands, and he has a successful trip. And Father, that your word is spread through his teaching of your word. Father, you give him a safe journey back as well. And as you forgive us where he fell, in Jesus' name we pray.